we did an interview with someone that was going to be a source for us. He was a lawyer, but he had kind of gone down a corrupt path. He gotten involved in drugs and alcohol. He was dating a woman who was a stripper and had addiction issues. That's all the facts, right? We're in an interview. The prosecutor is talking to him. His girlfriend is calling the phone over and over and over, which is interrupting what we're trying to do. The prosecutor yells at him and says, tell your coked up stripper girlfriend to knock it off. We're trying to get something accomplished here. In that instant, I watched his face just, we lost him completely.
Today at Mindful Negotiating, it's a party. In addition to Colleen and myself, we have Melissa Fortunato, former FBI hostage and crisis negotiator, and all-around wonderful person. We're going to have this talk that I'm really grateful to have been witness to, where we're really wedding theory and practice and putting them in a conversation, which is, I think the highest goal we could aspire to. We're going to be talking about deception, body language to some extent, but trying to break them down from their kind of like clickbaity titles more towards a conversation about communication theory and negotiation.
Yeah, this one's really fun. As you'll hear, it starts with a conversation that Max and I had just one afternoon, and we concluded at the end of that conversation that we really should have Melissa on. And so that's what we did. We brought her on. So this first part is just Max and I sort of going through the literature on deception, starting to think about how it integrates into negotiation. And then we get to the good stuff with Melissa, whose experience is just so rich. And on top of that, she's just a very cool hang. So enjoy.
Hey, Colleen, query for you. In an interaction, in a negotiation, how do I know when someone's lying?
Okay. So first, I want to say we have a fascination with deception. And I think we spend too much time worrying about it in negotiations. That's the first thing I want to say. Largely, whether or not someone is lying to you is irrelevant to the moves that you're going to be making in a negotiation. So trying to spend a lot of time figuring out if they're lying is not necessarily where I would put your effort. Second to that, and maybe just as important, there are no universal signs of deception. So there is some psychology to suggest that there are micro movements that we make in our face when we say something that is dissonant with what we believe. That is really hard to extract as a blatant lie. And even those things, dilated pupils, turn in the corner of your mouth, things like that, are not 100% accurate. There are people who sometimes speed up when they're lying when they're speaking. There are people who slow down when they're lying when they're speaking. So in general, looking for these nonverbal or vocal cues when people are lying as some sort of universal telltale sign is just unfortunately not true. I feel like I'm telling the magician's tricks, but lying is incredibly personal. I'll say it that way. The other thing that I'll say about deception, because I find this topic really interesting, is that the research suggests that most lies are in service of connection. So we lie more to strangers. We lie more if we're extroverted. Men lie more about themselves. Women lie more about others. Everybody lies. Babies will fake cry for attention. They'll bluff. 5-year-olds will use fake flattery. 5-year-olds will lie to you. Wow. So just sort of pulling back the curtain on deception and recognizing that it's a tool that we use often to connect, but that there's this idea called truth to fault theory, which is Tim Levine's theory. It's a communication theory, fairly recent, I think 2014, that talks about our baseline is to use truths. Our baseline is to tell the story. And when we come to a conjunction or a fork in the road where the truth isn't matching up with our goal, then that threshold of what I'm comfortable with varies individual to individual of how many lies I'll use in service of those goals. So just kind of like sort of talking about deception at large, it's a little bit more helpful to think about it as like a very human thing, and a piece of communication rather than, needing to figure someone out, needing to really understand if they're trying to pull one over on me.
Well, I love that framing of what the other person does isn't necessarily going to inform the way I think, or rather that like your energy is better spent on the question, what is my best response here, as opposed to, do I think they're lying or not? Because you may never know. I think it's Joe Navarro who wrote What Every Body Is Saying. He's former FBI, who says exactly, to some extent, what you say, which is, depends on the person's baseline. Like, a lot of the things we associate, at least as far as I understand, with lying have a lot to do with pacifying behaviors, touching the face, like things that alleviate anxiety. Great. Congratulations. There's someone who's demonstrating anxiety. Or maybe that is how someone always is. So what we're curious about is actually their deviation from their baseline. But even then, yeah, it's tough. And I don't know if this has any resonance in research, the literature, or communications theory, Colleen. But I sometimes think about emotional truth, which is the way that I think people, including myself, have deceived themselves thinking that it's okay to say something. So for instance, I think about Trump, who is notable in his relationship with the truth. But I wonder if a lot of his base sometimes feels like there's an emotional resonance, that generally his expression of anger at feeling shame or not being in front of the line where you think you ought to be, whatever it may be, if there's not an irrelevance to the facticity of what he's saying, because it strikes an emotionally resonant chord.
Yeah, absolutely. There's tons of research to support that. It's why the polygraph fails. If I believe in the thing that I'm saying, even though the veracity of it can be checked in an objective manner, I will register it as a truth in my body. I will show no sort of physiological signs of discomfort, because it is expressing to you the thing that feels the truest for me, which is why deception is so tricky. And the other thing that I thought Tim Levine did well with truth default theory is that instead of measuring physiological signs or nonverbal cues, one of the better ways to understand deception is communication patterns. So we tend to have our own personal threshold with comfortability of lying. Some people are more comfortable with it than others. And in general, the number of truths to lies that we tell stays pretty constant. It's different in different domains, and of course it can change over your lifetime, but in general, this person who tells 12 truths for every one lie is going to do that in most situations. So this thing that you're saying about baseline, which is also true for nonverbal cues, is true for our communication patterns as well. So if you're in a negotiation with somebody repeatedly, knowing that is helpful. Knowing that, okay, there's probably going to be a couple fibs or extensions of truths here, because that's how this person communicates. That's how they get across what they're trying to say.
Colleen, I'm wondering if you or anyone in your field makes a distinction between constructing something that isn't truthful versus omitting something that's a material fact.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, and it is outside my domain a little bit. I am sure that there are folks who have studied that, but I don't know them off the top of my head. The thing that I have thought about is that, there are justifications and attributions that we make for all of our claims, right? So we've talked about attribution error, the idea that if I get in a car accident, it's because there were bad drivers on the road. If you get in a car accident, it's because you're a bad driver, right? That we sort of attribute things differently depending on ourselves versus other people. And that shows up in lying as well. People are lying. Other people are lying because they're trying to pull one over on me, because they're dishonest, because they don't know how to talk about the truth. Whereas I lie because I'm trying to tell the real truth, which is sort of beyond these lies. So I don't know. That's a great question, and I'd love to look into it and get back to you. But yeah, I don't know.
I mean, we talk about this drive to avoid loss, or more specifically, not be taken advantage of, as I think a governing dynamic in a negotiation for sure, which leads to what in international relations, we call a security dilemma, that the defensive measures that we take are perceived as offensive, which then create create arms races of a type. I think you also think it as the prisoner's dilemma, or just avoidance of shame. and how the attribution error, which I remember the fundamental attribution error in this way, that when I'm walking and I'm a pedestrian, I think drivers of cars are assholes. And when I'm a driver in a car, I think that pedestrians are assholes.
Yep.
And so I think to some extent that's right on. Not only do we not want to be taken advantage of, but the very same things that we're engaging in, we attribute to different motives, which then reinforce our own defensive stuff. And so if I were to really try and simplify like negotiation and conflict, it would be, can you get to a communication and relationship place where you are telling the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I just thought about with, as it pertains to fabrication, like out of thin air lies kind of thing, which I would love to revisit this topic with Melissa, as you said, because she would have a lot of insight here to offer.
Definitely.
But in terms of fabrication, I also think that would be a slippery slope, only because we know that memory is so fallible, right? So we know that people can construct false memories. We know that if you give people bits of information that are relatively similar to something they've experienced, they can create whole stories about what happened and fully believe them while not being mentally ill. This is somebody who's very healthy, very even cognitively with it, and can take little bits of information and form these false memories. And so I would say that I would guess, and again, I don't know, but I would guess that sort of understanding fabrication of lies would become really slippery, just due to memory in general. But it's an interesting question. We should tease it out a little bit more. Maybe I'll do some reading, and then we can invite Melissa to come talk with us.
One more question for you, if you have time.
Yeah.
I think it's Albert Morabian where we get this. What is this? 1835, 55?
55% of communication is nonverbal. Is that Morabian equation? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we call the words we use the lyrics, the tone we use the music, and our body language the dance. So obviously some differences in what's being communicated based on the medium in terms of what we can or can't see. I'm wondering how you feel about this, the utility of this breakdown of 55% is nonverbal, or how much weight you place on tone versus words, or how you think about that.
I think about this a lot. It might be my Roman Empire. I'm not sure. Because I am a communication scholar who's wildly interested in words, and that accounts for less than 7% of our communication are the actual words that we say, according to the Morabian equation. Right. I think it is useful insofar as understanding how much our bodies are communicating to one another all the time and how simple that is. If I'm talking to you, Max, and you're telling me about something hard and I tilt my head, you all of a sudden understand that I am wanting to engage empathetically. That is such a small thing. I may not know the words at all to say. Yeah, it has to be sincere. I think this would communicate something differently. But it is proven time and time again. And so the other things that's really interesting about the nonverbal communication is that it is universal, that most nonverbal communication is universal. There are some things that are culturally defined, but for the most part, our facial expressions are universally understood. I think that's the first piece of it, is just even recognizing that contributes so much. And then I think tone, which I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, is another thing that is underrated, that we don't think enough about the way that our tone is coming across, partially because we can't hear ourselves. So anyway, throwing it to you, tell us a little bit about tone and its role in all of this.
From my limited understanding of neuroscience, and this is from Shilheen and Doug Stone's Thanks for the Feedback, there's a part of the brain called the superior temporal sulcus, and it's the part of the brain that animates when tone of voice is at play. I think specifically when children are young and their mother's speaking, it activates. So we think that that's the part of the brain that registers tone, and it turns off while we're speaking, which, at least for me, helps to understand why when I hear a recording of myself, I say, whoa, I sound that way, or why anyone would say that there's genuinely a tone deafness to our own speech while we're speaking, which I don't know what the percentage is, but it is the start of many a conflict. That's not how I said it. It's like, yeah, you did not hear it the way that I heard it, right? And that is because of the actual design of our brains. So tone is big. The other thing I always think about is that study that Malcolm Gladwell cites in Blink, which is they took the first and last 10 seconds of a conversation between a surgeon and their patient. They analyzed it for tone, just tone, how warm, how hostile, how dominant, how anxious. And with over 95% accuracy, we're able to predict whether or not that patient would sue that surgeon over the next 2 years. So for me, tone implies a relationship. Like tone is something that is very, in my mind, tangible. It is a reflection, a sonic reflection of how I understand our relationship. And if I were to hedge a guess in that study, the relationship between the surgeon and patient was something to the effect of, I know more than you. I'm smarter than you. Like, I know what's best for you. And something that was so status unequal that people naturally chafed at it.
Yeah. I mean, bringing this back to deception, tone is also really hard to fake. So
Yes.
I don't know the specifics of that particular study, but part of why it is such an indicator for us about how things are going in the conversation is that if our heart rate is elevated, it is really hard to change our tone. We also are incredibly sonically sensitive. So when somebody's speaking at a lower register, it actually helps to lower the other person's heart rate. And so there are all these things that are happening within our bodies that are coming out sonically, that even though we're saying words, our bodies are telling the other person, here's how I'm feeling, here's what's going on. We're not very good at knowing that in the moment and communicating it in the moment. And so tone is one of those things that really helps to communicate. The other thing that just dawned on me, do you remember the first time you heard your own voice? Like, I remember, I think I was like 7 or 8, and I like remember hearing my own voice on like a voicemail.
Wow.
And I was like, is that what I sound like? And what I just dawned on me is like, with technology and with social media, there is a whole generation now that probably doesn't have that event, doesn't have that moment. They just grow up to some extent thinking they know the sound of their own voice.
I wonder that, or I wonder, so there's definitely more data developed that would enable them to hear their own voice. But I would think, and I'm thinking about the article, Learning How to Learn to Negotiate, people avoid that objective data all the time. So I think the younger generations are generating more data, but whether or not they're actually choosing to look or listen to it. I mean, I would say for like those who are particularly self-conscious on social media, which I don't know how you cannot be, you're probably actually reviewing yourself before you put something out. Not really sure. Like, we've talked about the excruciating dilemma of watching ourselves or listening to ourselves. And
it's tough.
And then the piece that I'm thinking about, because it's a space where I think I have it's a growth edge for me, is cadence. And I don't know where that fits exactly, but I like to expand the idea of tone into like a more of a musical thing where you have also cadence. And that is another way to influence the dynamic or atmosphere.
Yeah. Yeah, to be clear, in the Moravian equation, it's vocal linguistics. So all cadence is in there as well.
Cool.
Yeah, the other thing that I'm just thinking about is we're thinking about communicating through media and through mediums, is that with every channel, pieces of communication are lost. So there's the most amount of communication coming at you in a face-to-face interaction. This also means it's a lot harder to listen for content because you're listening for a lot of other things. And if there are competing pieces of communication, meaning my body language is not matching up with my words, we are listening to the body language over the words, right? So then those things compete. The thing that is interesting to me in that is that moving models of learning online are helping to deliver content more clearly. I don't have to worry about the competing information as much, but they are taking away from the interpersonal communication of nonverbal communication and emoting. And so I just think that'll be an interesting thing as we become a more technologically advanced and reliant society.
Technologically advanced, emotionally regressive. The one thing I think about is, how like people often forget the person's name right after they introduce themselves. I wonder if we can attribute it to what you were saying there. the ladder of inference in me just thinks about selected data and how it's so important. You're so worried about yourself and your presentation that you're so focused that you don't see, select, or even remember something that really just came right at you.
I think that is totally true. People don't like to hear this, but there's no research to suggest that anyone is bad at names. It is a selective attention issue. And I feel that way. I feel like I used to be amazing at names. I would never forget a name. And now as we move to sort of more tech stuff, it is a struggle for me. And I would love to blame it on the technology, but I don't know.
Yeah. They say, and I think about this in terms of relationship and negotiation, that there is no word more beautiful to anyone in any language than their own name.
Interesting. That's tough.
Don't you think so, Colleen?
It took me a long time to love my name. I know, but the sentiment, I believe for sure that, yeah. And I mean, here we are listening to our own voices. So.
And how beautiful they are.
Oh gosh. So maybe we should end it here. So I did in fact go and do some reading, and we did invite Melissa on, and I'm going to let her talk now, as she has a lot of experience in the field and some really good insights on deception and lying. Enjoy.
Welcome everyone to the Mindful Negotiating Show. I'm here with my colleagues and friends, Melissa Fortunato, who's a former FBI hostage negotiator, an integral part of the Mindful Negotiating team, and Colleen, who has her PhD in crisis communications and is an integral part of the team as well at Mindful Negotiating. So our lead-off question here is directed towards Melissa. Just based on your experience, specifically in the FBI, how can you tell if someone is lying?
That is a very challenging question. I know we have discussed this before, and I think people worry so much about, how am I going to tell if someone's lying or not? I think we all have those innate abilities to sense something seems off, and that's probably your best guide, really. I don't like to teach anybody that there's this trick or this technique, or you watch for this, the way the eyes go up in a certain direction, that means they're lying. I think people get focused on the wrong things when that happens. I think it's a totality of behavior. And one of the important things with that to know is knowledge is power in any negotiation. Right? So as much information that you have, you could use it one of two ways. You could, which we did a lot in the FBI, was you would have information and we trust but verify. Right? So I may ask you a question I already know the answer to. And if that's the case, that allows me to see kind of how we have started this conversation, this relationship, this negotiation, by somewhat seeing if I'm going to get back the information I already know, right? I'm always testing against what I already know. So I think that's one way that you can do it if you are unsure. But what I will say is I think I kind of anticipated a lot in my work in the FBI that people probably were going to lie to me to some degree. That anticipation allowed me to not have such a dramatic response to it. I think many times in relationships or negotiations, people get so offended when people lie. I don't know if they weren't expecting it. And then it becomes more about respect and a bigger issue than understanding why people are lying, which I think is the main question. What is behind the reason for the lie?
So two follow-up questions I'm thinking about. How are you defining lie in terms of, is it something that you construct that is fictitious? Is it exaggerating something to a certain degree, misremembering something, or is a critical omission of fact sufficient for lying? Well, let's start there.
Yeah, there are a lot of shades to it. Sometimes it's perspective. Sometimes it is a factual misrepresentation. And so you have to be clear on the question that you're asking, what you're seeking to get back. And so being clear in your communication, clarifying any assumptions you're making that maybe didn't come out completely to make sure everyone fully understands what we're discussing, the importance of it, or Any ambiguity that you want to clear up is important in that too. Because I think you're right. I think sometimes people's thoughts and feelings, just in my work in the FBI, interviewing witnesses, people see different things, people perceive different things. And so it may not be a lie, it just is different. And so it is important to understand that, to how you're going to proceed and react to it.
Melissa, I love that you mention what I would describe as like contextual clues or more sort of verbal or linguistic clues about lying, because that is what the research supports. I feel like we've become really interested in this idea that there could be these nonverbal cues. And I think that the TV show Lie to Me really popularized this, which is that if you are hyper vigilant to micro movements in the face, you'll be able to tell if somebody's lying. And the research just suggests that that's not really true. There are sort of times at which there's nonverbal leakage, but that's different for every person. And often when we're assessing on nonverbal, we're actually worse. So it's really interesting to hear that from your experience, that is also true, that sort of going down this line of questioning seems to be more helpful. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about a time in which this came up, if you have a story about somebody who was trying to deceive or lie, and how you were able to sort of use questions or that line of thinking to better understand deception within the whole story.
I will say one thing that came up for me when you were just talking there is I agree with you that people read something, watch a TV show, focus solely on one part. What ends up happening, and we all do this in conversation, negotiation, is you stop listening to what's actually being said then, because you're so focused on one small part. And we all have that thing in our mind where it can take you off track if you get singular focused on one thing. And so I would prefer people to listen to the totality of the information. You are assessing the nonverbals as they're coming in, for sure. You are. And I think that's why we all get that feeling of, that doesn't seem right. But you're comparing it to the information that you know. And so I think that that's more important, the listening, because you'll get the clues. What I have found in addressing deception is that you have to ask a series of questions. People tend to, when they're lying, they don't have all the information because it's not true. And so the more questions you can ask and keep pushing forward with your questioning, it's hard for them to maintain it. And so my experience, we had this one source that was awful. And he would just, he was very truthful on some things, and probably the other half of the time was not. So you had to vet and verify everything. And what ended up happening was he would jump down all these different avenues and change topics. And when you would try to take him straight down one lane, he would get off track on the stuff he was not truthful on. And I think we see some of this with politicians and people we see on television. It's a quick word, when confronted, move on to something else, high dramatics, high emotion. And if you can just say, I just want to keep going on this path, I think for people, it's difficult to maintain that if they're lying to you, to stay straight. So I think that's like one tip that's helpful.
Melissa, the idea of a totality is so helpful. And I think the one book I read on this was, we've talked about Joe Navarro's What Every Body Is Saying.
Yep.
Because I got into negotiation for the wrong reasons. Like, I wanted to be cool. I wanted to be socially influential. Like, I wanted the referent power that I sought growing up in my WASPy hometown. But what it turns out is that, like, the idea of looking for a tell, I think, is a misnomer, if I'm understanding it correctly, just because it's a totality, right? Absolutely, someone touching their face might be pacifying nerve endings because they're anxious or nervous. Maybe they're just an anxious person. So without the baseline of knowing what they normally do, it's, to my mind, what I took away was the deviation from the baseline is an indicator of stress. But also this presumes our relationship to self and our, is there some emotional truth beneath the lie that makes it justified, right? Are there things that justify a lie? And I guess while we have a former hostage negotiator, let me just ask, justifiable, like, to totally lie, let's say, to someone who's barricaded themselves in, to say, hey, we're going to send in pizzas, and then not send it in and rest? Like, are there also situations in negotiation dramatically where you can and should lie?
I think the importance when thinking about lying is understanding, this is true in everything, your goal. What is your purpose? What is your goal? So I'm conflicted myself because I used to do undercover work. The whole premise of it is a lie. Maybe if I understood in my head that it was for a greater good, in pursuit of justice, catching bad guys, I'm a good guy, it's a little easier to do. I understood what my goal was and the purpose of why I was doing it. Relationally, that's not good. But I recognize the reality of depending on the reason. So as a negotiator, I'm open to all of it. I just want to understand why it's happening. And I think there is so much behind why people lie. And understanding that, is it shame? Is it loss of position, respect, relationship? Sometimes people worry so much on how do I know and how can I confront it and how can I make it stop happening? To me, that's all control. If you focus more on understanding what it is and you can talk to that, I think you are so much more powerful in all negotiations because you're speaking to what that issue is. And then maybe it does uncover the truth because you understood the why behind it, started to talk to that, which allowed them psychological safety or openness in the conversation to tell you the truth. Then you get to those options and true interests, right? That people sometimes are afraid to share.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm wondering why you think, this is just off the cuff, but why you think we have such an aversion to being lied to. Why does it bother us so much?
Don't you lie to me.
Yeah, I think it's a respect point for people. It's also that I don't have all the information for myself to make choice, right? It comes back to all the things we care about: autonomy, recognition, those things that are important. And I think it probably hits on some of those core things for people.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's just interesting to think about, even when you were talking about this line of questioning, if you do feel like somebody is just being deceptive, and you mentioned that they'll want to sort of put more details, or they'll really want control of the narrative. And so it's interesting on the flip side, as a negotiator, relinquishing some of that control actually becomes a really helpful tactic to better understand what's going on. Because otherwise there's this fight for control rather than a discovery of truths or discovery of more information. That's really interesting. Okay, I have a personal question. Do you remember the first time in an interrogation or otherwise that you knew you were being lied to?
I don't know if I have a set example that stands out to me. Like, I don't remember John telling me XYZ and I knew instantly. You will know. And I think sometimes just setting the stage. So we did it, not everybody gets the ability to do this, but we would frame our interviews and start them off by saying, we're going to ask a series of questions. I just wanted to let you know it is an additional crime to lie to me as a federal agent. So if you feel that you can't answer the question, tell me that. If you'd like to come back to it, tell me that, because I don't want us to get locked in where something else happens that we can't turn back from. And I think that just created a space for people where you're giving them additional choices before they feel not that they had to lie, but they got locked into a lie. And it's really difficult for people to back up from that. So I tried to create the space where you don't have to do that, or there's an option where you can choose something else. And I won't pressure you if you tell me I can't answer that one question. So I just made me think of an example. So I was interviewing someone that was part of the January 6th protests and went into the Capitol building when they shouldn't have, and asking him a series of questions. And he was like, I did this, I did that. I was like, okay, did you go inside the Capitol? And he was like, I don't want to answer that right now. Okay. And then we moved on to something else. But I knew that's where we are. Now, at the time, I did not have the evidence that he was in the building yet.
Interesting.
I was able to later, through video surveillance, to find out he was. But that was like 2 months after I interviewed him.
Yeah.
Wow.
But he was able to answer all the questions that led up to it that weren't a crime, but he just couldn't admit that one part. And what I have learned from people, they really don't want to lie. It doesn't make them feel good. And so I've had the mix. I've had people that just lie because it's what they're used to doing. I've also had people tell me things that are completely against their self-interest because of 2 reasons. They couldn't manage the stress, and it just was getting too overwhelming. But if you create the right connection and conversation that allows them the safety to open up, they will. I think fear and threats is not necessarily the way to get that honesty. Sometimes people, I just think, it just is too much to hold it all in, and they want to get it out for that reason. So it is on you. There is a responsibility, I think, on the other end to create a space where they can do that.
I just want to put a beautiful bow around this demonstration of being hard on the problem but soft on the person.
Yeah. Yes.
This is what Roger Fisher would say is, I think, like one of the maxims of negotiation, to be hard on the problem but soft on the person. And I think it's, maybe this is, I don't know how appropriate this quote is, but it's a Churchill quote that, like, when you have to kill a man or woman, it costs nothing to be polite. And in fact, it's interesting that you are getting information specifically by enabling someone to withhold it, right? He's letting you know he probably went in, but preserves a certain interest. So like it just seems very constructive, as much as we can, to be soft on the person, and that's easier said than done.
And I will tell you, in that instance, what I said was, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Like, actually, thank you for not lying to me. I do think you can speak into a person the behavior you want to see, right? By when they are doing even a small version of what you want.
Yes.
Recognizing it, acknowledging it, thanking it, encouraging it will allow them to want to be that person for you. And so in my interrogations and interviews, in my parenting, in my romantic relationship with my husband, it's all of these things that you can do proactively that hopefully stop someone from wanting to lie to you. And so you don't even have that interaction to create that conflict.
That to me is such a beautiful articulation of unconditional positive regard from Carl Rogers. That it's not just that I hold you, that I'm perhaps most powerful when I'm just holding you in positive regard, esteem, or I think, Melissa, what you're saying, which is helping me understand the concept, to have high expectations for someone and to assume them. I assume you're going to do the right thing. Like I am going to try and reflect back to you, simply what's happening. I mean, this is just the idea of motivational interviewing, which we just talked about in our the last class that we just did. And from Adam Grant's, I think it's chapter 7 of Think Again, about immunization and how to convince people to take vaccines. And the idea is that when you fight too hard or try and argue with someone and someone feels like a bad parent or you're talking down to them, like it's not very effective. And they found out, at least from what I can tell, the most effective way was simply to hold them in unconditional positive regard and ask them about their beliefs.
And be open to hear it, to try hard to understand it from their perspective. Even if you can find just a small little foothold to grab a hold of that makes sense to you, you don't have to walk down the whole line. In my work as an FBI agent, I don't understand why you did the spinal thing that got you in front of me as an FBI agent, but can I understand the series of steps that got you there? Yes. And that connection, that recognition of the connection of how we're similar, I think creates a space where people aren't afraid to open up about things.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're talking about is I think it's McGuire's theory from the 60s is inoculation theory. And this idea that communicatively we can start to inoculate someone to beliefs just by assuming that they are lying or assuming that they are oppositional. And so this happens with political beliefs. I think this is what Adam Grant is borrowing from, which is that like, if the more I try to convince you of my idea, the more resistant you become to it just by pure opposition.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of what you're discussing, Melissa, makes so much sense in terms of avoiding that desire to want to fight back or fight against. And I'm interested specifically in this sort of like removing judgment piece, because I think it's, for me, easier done in my work than it is in my personal life.
Yeah.
It becomes like a personal affront in my personal life when somebody is lying to me, whereas in my work I can say, okay, this lie is in service of something.
Yeah.
And so I'm more interested in that something. But yeah, I'm curious, hearing you sort of talk about this permeating your personal life as well, like how you go about thinking about that, or is part of the secret to just not think about lying, like just not focus on it as much. What do you think?
I do think mindset is really important. And so if you are in a protective mindset, a fear mindset, a control mindset,
Yeah.
you are always looking and grabbing for those things. And I don't think that is the way you want to show up a lot of times in relationships. So whether it's with my children, right? My goal is the relationship. My goal is the openness, because if I give you a hard time, if you lie over something silly, because I'm trying to teach you to not be a liar in the world, because I have this responsibility as your parent, right? So I have to address every small or big lie. But my response in the small things will dictate what you'll tell me when it's big. And so this idea of your proactive approach to your negotiations, your personal relationships, and setting the stage so when it matters, they know you to be someone that they can come to. Right. So
That's so good.
yeah. So in like, I just remember we did an interview with someone that was going to be a source for us. He was a lawyer, but he had kind of gone down a corrupt path. He gotten involved in drugs and alcohol. He was dating a woman who was a stripper and had addiction issues. That's all the facts, right? We're in an interview. The prosecutor is talking to him. His girlfriend is calling the phone over and over and over, which is interrupting what we're trying to do. The prosecutor yells at him and says, "Tell your coked up stripper girlfriend to knock it off. We're trying to get something accomplished here."
Wow.
In that instant, I watched his face just, we lost him completely.
Yeah.
Now, factually, was some of that true? Is his girlfriend a stripper? Yes. Was his girlfriend have addiction issues? Yes. Did we need to accomplish something right there and she was getting in the way? All true. But the way that you communicated that, you instantly lost that relationship, and he didn't cooperate. We didn't get the information that we needed, and potentially lost out on an investigation that could have led to something.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's so important in those things. There could have been a totally different way to have said what she said, but because she said it that way, we lost the relationship instantly. You could see it come right over him.
Yeah.
You can be right or you can be effective.
Right. Correct. Yes.
Yeah. And also speaking, lying has so much to do with identity. And so speaking to somebody, making a judgment about somebody's identity or who somebody is, immediately is going to communicate that you may not be deserving of the truth from them. So that's such a poignant example.
Yeah.
Sometimes people meet lying with anger and accusation and shame again. And I have never seen it work where you have been screamed at and shamed, where someone then said, "I'm going to completely open up to you now and tell you all the awful things I've done." Right? The only way I've seen it be most effective is through connection, through vulnerability. And sometimes I think that comes from us understanding ourselves. Why do you lie in your life, big or small? What happened? why did you find yourself walking down that path? And I think that understanding allows us to bring that understanding to other relationships and create that space where people think, okay, maybe I won't be judged.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about from like a parent perspective, the power of modeling that. I remember talking to a friend about um, rehearsing apologies and if she should, make her kid apologize just for the sake of apology, even if the kid isn't sorry. And I was like, first of all, I'm not a parent. I don't know. But second of all, like, is it a practice? Do you apologize to your kid? And I think the same is true with lying, right? Like,
Yeah.
are there times in my friendships, I'm not a parent, but if I had a child with my child where I said, I didn't really tell the full truth there because there was a lot going on, or
Yeah.
I was caught up in the moment. And is there a way to sort of model that and say, because we just learn so much better by experiencing that grace or
Yes.
that communication from someone else. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, this idea of it being important to negotiate a certain way, not just because it's effective, but because it provides potentially corrective experiences for people. Like in the last class that we did, we basically did an exercise where we used Moshe Cohen's listening triangle. Just, ask an open-ended question, listen, reflect that understanding, repeat, like to some extent. And also the difference between it being genuine, being able to feel whether or not someone's curious or not, right? And what it's like to hear someone say the right thing, but to know that the customer service person doesn't really understand when they say, yes, I understand. Yes, I understand. Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's also really important, or at least for me, the reason we care about helping people negotiate is it makes our lives easier, like for the people around us to know these concepts as well. But also you can really be helping a person by listening. Like the grace you can extend ripples. It really, really does. And I say that as someone who came to the negotiation space, who was not used to feeling particularly deeply listened to. And that was, and how transformative that is. And there's some line, I'll have to find it, might be a poem or something, but it says something like that the difference between being loved and being heard maybe is not a difference at all.
I love that. I agree with you both. And I feel like I'm spending a lot of time in my life right now thinking around that idea of modeling the behavior you want to see. Call it manifesting, modeling, whatever you call it. Because I do think, Colleen, like you said, in parenting, do I apologize to my kids? Yes. Because I do make a mistake. And if I don't ever show you that I can make a mistake or that I was trying to communicate well with you, I gave into my frustration, or I'm not in my best place to have this conversation right now, the vulnerability of me being able to say that to you teaches you how to do it.
Absolutely.
But can we do this at work with each other? Yes. Did I do it with criminals? Yes. There is,
Wow.
like Max,
Yeah.
you said, a transformative power to be able to do this. I mean, I would be arresting people and I would say, they were like, wow, you're being really nice. I don't need to be not nice to you. If you're not nice, I can be not nice, but I don't need to make this harder than it is. I have a job. We're going to go forward with this arrest and getting you processed, but I don't need to add layers of shame on top of everything.
Right.
And I've had people then come back later and then they may tell you information because of how you treated them initially. So if I'm actually going to be an effective law enforcement officer, that is what I want, right? I want people to let me know when things are happening that I don't know about because I don't run in those circles. And so it is so important, I think, to really model what you want to see. We do that in negotiations, right? I don't want you to be competitive with me. So I need to maybe lead proactively by saying, hey, here's something I'm worried about, to show that vulnerability to allow you to do it back to me. I just think that puts people out of that fight or flight mode in their brains, and then they can think clearer. They're more creative, all the good things that we want in a negotiation or a conflict resolution.
Yeah. Melissa, I love talking with you. You have such a seasoned perspective and balance on a lot of these things. And I remember one of the first conversations we had, and you have such a good ability to quickly be curious. And I think that is such an important skill in this world. And it is, for me, I consider myself relatively curious, and still it
Yeah.
is a muscle that I feel like I need to train like first thing in the morning, or it will get the
Yeah.
best of me. You know,
Yeah.
I'll find myself in a situation, arriving at conclusions without first asking those questions. And especially I think when it comes to deception, you said something earlier that really hit the nail on the head, which is like, it angers us, or it feels disrespectful, or, and so as those our alarms are going off, our curiosity and our kindness and our openness shuts down. So I really appreciate you sort of reframing deception for us and allowing us to think about it as information, and maybe even like a guiding light of like, oh, there's something more going on here that I haven't figured out. This person is lying
I love
for a
that.
reason. So thank you for all of that insight.
No,
Thank
thank
you.
you for that, because I love that that is true, right? It should be emotions. If you can take the judgment off of it, it's just indicators of an
Yes.
area to pay attention to. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Good, bad, nothing. It's just an area to go forward with. And so in deception, it's that weird gut feeling, the answer is different than you heard before. That just means this is where we have to pay attention to, and just see it like that. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Colleen, I have a question for you, but also for Melissa, but specifically about, I think it's Paul Ekman's work and
Mhm.
facial action coding,
Yeah.
and what you think about that. And Melissa, I'm just thinking about like, is there a science of being able to identify patterns of muscle movements in the face to any extent that could give us information beyond it being voluntarily given?
So we have like a funny family joke. My husband, also an FBI agent, and he was on a behavioral analysis team, and they did a whole training on these tells that happen when people lie. And he calls, and we make a joke of it as our family. It's called Duper's Delight, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you do say something, it's that slight upturn of your mouth when you know that you're lying, right? And so we'll jokingly, like if someone will say something at the dinner table, we're like, Duper's Delight, Duper's Delight. Because it's that little that instantly your face gave away when you were not telling the truth.
Yeah.
I think, like we talked about earlier, it's hard to know that in someone that you're meeting for the first time, an interaction for the first time. So in my work in the FBI, sometimes I wasn't always in front of you. I might know a lot about you, but this is my first time interacting with you, because hopefully I was hiding in the shadows by investigation. And now I'm overt. And so that's why I didn't always look for those things, because I also cared more about the emotion, or I'm sorry, the information. And so I just really want to be a good listener. And I found that for me distracted me to focus on those things when I knew all the other stuff. I guess I trust myself enough to know I would get that feeling or that indicator, and it would allow me to be more curious and ask more questions around it. And as we discussed before, asking questions and going down that avenue with them, if they're lying, it'll show up even more, because they won't be able to keep going with you further and further into it.
Yeah, I just want to highlight what Melissa's saying, because the research backs all of this, which is that if these nonverbal cues of deception are what Ekman calls leakage, right? There are some, if liars tend to have more dilated pupils. They do sometimes, if they get away with a lie, the slight, like you said, duping delight, the slight corner upturn in the mouth. Actually, there's a great clip of Bill Clinton after he says, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." Shows some. That's a good example of duping delight. So if you're listening, you can Google that one to see exactly what we mean. There's, liars tend to be higher pitched. They tend to be more repetitive, but all of these things, I think, to Melissa's point, and then later to a 2003 sort of comprehensive review of the nonverbal cues also corroborates this. When you become focused on those things, you actually can be led astray, because they're not the be all end all. Those things can happen when somebody's not lying. They just are things that happen to show up in liars. And there are other things I just want to mention, because I feel like these are the things that people commonly think. So I do want to dispel. Filler words are not an indication of lying. Actually, liars tend to be more direct, because, to what Melissa said earlier, they're trying to control their speech and they're trying to control what happens. So there's actually less filler words usually. They don't avoid eye contact, contrary to popular belief. And Max, to your point of sort of using soothing behaviors, there's actually not really great evidence of that in liars either. So instead, sort of what the literature says, and I think Melissa's experience speaks to this, is that you're looking for contextual evidence and sort of straying away from this like direct honing in on of one thing, and instead using these contextual markers of that seems different behavior, that seems off, that's non-normative, or that's idiosyncratic, and why is that, what's going on there, and what are they trying to conceal, right? Because that can be a whole host of things. It may not even be an intentional concealment, but there's something going on there. So it's so fun. I love when the research adds up with the experience, and it's so fun getting to hear about your experience, Melissa. And I do want to just be mindful of time here at Mindful Negotiating and wrap us up, because I know you have another engagement to get to, and you've offered so much of us your time. So any closing thoughts here? Anything Max, go ahead.
It always just gets cooking like right at the end. And thank you for giving
right.
time. I'm thinking about internal family systems and the internal voices, the patterns of the internal voice, like the manager, that is very much a manager behavior to try and control, and would make sense then that it would be more control. Anyway, this is something that's so nice at Mindful Negotiating, where theory meets practice.
For someone that's more in the practice space than the theory space, it's wonderful to hear the research supports what my answer just was. So it doesn't make it,
That's
it's
what
just,
we're here for.
supporting each other.
There's a ton here. And also, Colleen, I just wanted to hit on the word leakage.
Of course you wanted to hit on a word.
Sorry. There was a famous religious studies professor at the University of Chicago named Jonathan Z. Smith. And apparently he would just sit back in his chair, chain smoking cigarettes, and say, the entire problem with religion is that humans are leaky. And so I think there is some anxiety here, but also it's topical in terms of the disconnect between what we think we are projecting in terms of our tone, the consistency of our body language, word choice, etc., and how we actually appear, and how vulnerable, I would say, even if not especially, the experts are. Like we're trying to model the behavior perpetually. And just one other thing, Melissa, that you were saying, just the mindset, how it's really hard to fake a behavior. If you ask me for a tip or a trick, I kind of already know it's not going to stick, because I'm sorry, I can't just give you the, if you see the eye move up and to the right in terms of neurolinguistic programming, they're lying. That doesn't exist. And that's a different market. That's a different market of things. And I think we're trying really hard to differentiate it, and having you two speaking on it really adds that dimension. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's such a fun conversation. It makes me think about it differently. And so I appreciate you guys sharing all your insights and perspectives and the research. It does help me. We talk about absorbing it at a cellular level, right?
Yeah.
And so taking all of that in and then checking it against what you know and seeing if it's still right is important.
And let us say amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed benefiting from the expertise of Colleen and Melissa as much as I did. If you want more of this, we've got it. And if you have questions or comments or suggestions for specific resources that would make your life easier in terms of the negotiations you face internally and externally, please let us know. More information is in the description if you'd like. Links are on our website and our social media at Mindful Negotiating. And see you next time.